I like to say what we're not gonna cover and what we are gonna cover. Um, well, specifically, I'll go in a little bit more detail in a second. Like, who can you um, measure? What can you measure? How can you measure it? And when you should measure it? And we'll end with why you should measure it. Though it's a little bit of a lie, and you'll find out in a second. So, what we're not going to be talking about is a lot of the things when what we typically think of when we think of measurement. We're not going to be talking about measuring science and engineering impacts like publications, venue citations, media mentions, things like that. We're not going to be talking about workforce impacts, such as the number of students who are funded, student placement, community participation, development, workforce retention and attraction. We're not going to be talking about economic impacts, any sort of pseudo ROI that you can create, or the amount of matching funds you get with your grants. We're not going to be talking necessarily about innovation impacts of patents, technology transfer to industry, or community well-being. What we are going to be talking about, though, is measuring team dynamics, measuring team outcomes. So just for terminology clarification, when I say team dynamics, I mean things like team processes, those behaviors, as Sean mentioned earlier, in emergent states. Team outcomes can be anything from performance to satisfaction to well-being. Specifically, I'll go into a little bit of ways to measure these components, the timing of measurement, and what do you do with this information. So actually, I switched the order up a little bit because what you kind of need to know why you're doing this before we get into what you're doing. So why you should measure your teams. A lot of this stuff we've been talking about, like improving team effectiveness, but you can't do that if you can't diagnose what's wrong with the team. You can throw everything you got at it, but if you don't know what's wrong with your team, a lot of those efforts to try and improve team effectiveness may not necessarily be effective. And so that's the take-home message in the context in which we are jumping into this right now. So we'll start off with who can you measure team stuff, team constructs. And so just for me to get a better understanding of who you think of when you think of the teams that you are a member of or the teams that you work with, we're going to use the Menti again a bit. And so, pull out your phones or go to Menti. The code is there. It's 35282709. Let me see if I can add that to the chat again. It's 35282709. And I'll switch my screen so we can see your answers coming in. So what are the teams that you feel like you're a member of? What are the teams that you work with? Are you working with primarily research teams, community teams? This is not a word cloud, so, well, maybe it is, dang it. Manuscript development teams, okay, so working with more academically based teams, service teams, community organizers, PI teams, working with teams of veterans, research teams, administration teams, systems teams. I love how many teams y'all are bringing into this. A lot of research teams, a lot of project management teams, so a lot of academically based teams. And it seems like many of these teams is really creating a distinction between your academic teams, the teams with the goals of publishing research articles and conducting basic or applied research, and those external teams, so those community stakeholder teams, systems health leaders, interdisciplinary teams. These are all excellent. And so that gives me a lot of confidence in going forward With the rest of this, I'll switch back to my presentation real quick. You guys have a lot to say. That's excellent. And so you're right. You have a bunch of different teams that you work with, and the members of these teams are different. You may have a main investigator team where you have your academic leads at your various institutions, along with community partners, whether they're in the role of an advisory board or providing a letter of support, or actually co-PIs on the grant. You may have private partners if you're looking to develop some tangible deliverable in terms of a new product innovation, as well as your administrative leads. Those are usually you have those at the top of the hierarchy. You have your research labs. Everyone on this call likely has participated or is leading one of these right now. You have your lab director, maybe some postdocs, grad students, lab manager, undergraduate research assistants, and maybe some site teams, for example, if there's a particular location that you're trying to inoculate some community members at, you'll have community members on that team, some academic representations, whether they're your graduate students or other folks that you hire from the university. You'll have volunteers that are providing these services, as well as medical professionals, who are actually probably providing these services, and volunteers helping coordinate these efforts. Importantly, we're going to be mentioning a lot of team constructs here, but I want you to realize that what you're measuring may look different depending on who you are measuring. So a shared mental model, it may be important for your investigator teams to have a shared vision of what you're trying to accomplish, and that content of what is shared is different than what you might see on a site team, where the effectiveness of the team performance is contingent more upon their understanding of the logistics and implementation barriers that the team is experiencing. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about who you're measuring. The content of what you're measuring may differ. So shared mental models may look different in a investigator team versus a site team. Also, the importance of what you're measuring for team success is going to depend on who you are measuring and when it is measured. So, for example, if you're measuring coordination, that may matter less in an investigator team, where the degree of interdependence may be lower than a site team or a research team, where you're working on a particular project or on a particular site, and you need to coordinate more effectively and more often. So it may weigh more in those sorts of teams versus an investigator team. Relatedly, these constructs will have different relationships with team effectiveness over time. So task conflict can produce some great innovation or idea generation at the beginning of the team's life cycle, during, say, brainstorming stages. But later on, say, when you're actually trying to apply this work to, when you're after you've designed your experiment and running participation, task conflict may be detrimental to team performance because it's not producing the innovation at the correct time. So you can measure a whole bunch of people, and different teams will require different metrics depending on when you are measuring them. And so we're gonna, I split up what you can measure into two different categories, as I mentioned earlier: team dynamics, which include team processes and emergent states, as well as team outcomes. So team dynamics are not necessarily the outcomes that you think of when you think of effectiveness. They are the things that lead you there. And Sean has covered this relatively well. They're the factors that facilitate the accomplishment of these outcomes and the impacts that you want to achieve. And I have a whole bunch of fancy videos that I will go through quickly to give you sort of an idea of some of these constructs, even though Sean mentioned a lot of these. So team communication, so not, as Sean mentioned, not necessarily just the amount of communication, but what teams are sharing with one another. Team coordination, so the degree that the team is working in tandem with one another. And Sean covered great examples of these in the leadership part of the workshop that she just mentioned. Team conflict is also something that's important to measure. Conflict can appear in many different ways. It could be task conflict, which this is exactly the way it sounds, dealing with task components. It can be relationship conflict, so how people don't get along with one another on a relationship basis. And then there's also process conflict. So conflict about how things get done is another type of conflict that you may want to measure along the way. And the last process that I will be talking about is team leadership. So you can measure team leadership in various ways, as Sean mentioned. You can also measure team leader emergence, which may not necessarily be great for what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, but perceived effectiveness will certainly be important. Some of the important emergent states that you probably want to measure while your team is developing is shared mental models. So the degree to which people sort of have the same lens in which they view the problem space, as well as transactive memory. And I'm reiterating things that we've talked about before. Who knows what on the team? We've talked a lot about measuring trust. So the idea that somebody's competent and you can give them more task-based things to do, as well as psychological safety. We've mentioned these things as important, but I also want to really emphasize that you can measure these. You can measure the degree to which folks feel comfortable expressing themselves throughout the duration of the team's lifespan. And lastly, I'll talk about team cohesion, so the degree to which teams like each other, their willingness to get along. So out of these, you can measure any of these really, and I'll talk about some best practices here in measuring these in just a little bit. Oh, there's the chime again. It's perfect timing. Can I find them? I'm proud of myself of how quickly I found the mute button this time. All right, so you can measure these throughout the team's lifespan, but as you'll see in a moment, when you measure these, it's going to matter a lot. There's also team outcomes. So team outcomes can be anything from team performance. So is the team meeting their goals in a timely manner? These can be measured using, say, self-report or objective indicators, which we'll get to in a minute. Team attitudes, so team satisfaction, so the degree to which folks are happy with the team, viability and potency, the team's belief that they can accomplish whatever they're facing. And I know I put team learning down there twice, and it's because a lot of these constructs can be measured either as sort of team dynamics or team outcomes. So learning can be measured from a behavioral standpoint, which are effective learning behaviors. And Sean and I have a meta-analysis coming out showing that no matter what you do, team learning behaviors are good for your team performance, no matter what type of team you are or the circumstances, your team size. It always promotes performance. Team resilience is a similar construct. You can conceptualize it as an emergent state, so an attitude or motivational component that the team has. You can also operationalize it as a performance indicator, so the degree to which, say, something happens to the team, the speed at which they fall and the speed at which they recover back up to their baseline performance. And importantly, team well-being, as we've mentioned several times during this workshop, seeing how your team is doing is going to be very important to how effective they are going forward. Now, we've talked about the constructs, but how can you actually get at these? Well, I categorize them into three main ways, and I think if I were to summarize this in a sentence, you're going to be using self-report measures, and here's why. So The best way to assess what people are thinking or feeling is simply to ask them. There may be biases, and you'll hear a lot about biases associated with self-report measures, but you really can't get into somebody's head without asking them first. So their behaviors may represent something different to them as it represents to you. So ask them, self-report, and there's tons of different self-report questionnaires out there that you can use. And some key recommendations when you're searching for these measures are: ensure that you're looking for, when you find a measure that you think you like, that the items themselves refer to the team in the in the items. So my team is cohesive, not I am cohesive with my team, for example. So my team engages in effective learning behaviors, not I engage in effective learning behaviors, because that's really what you're trying to get at, right? You're not trying to get at someone's perception of themselves. You're trying to get at the team as a whole. So always be sure when you're selecting your measures that the referent in those items are the team and not the individuals. And a lot of private practices have proprietary measures that they use that they think that get at these sort of dimensions. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not up to snuff when you try and look at their psychometric properties. So they're not incredibly reliable. You see a lot of deviation between team members and what they think the items mean. So we've been doing this for a long time. And if you're going to measure these things, use measures that folks have used previously. Some more logistical things for you to keep in mind when measuring these constructs is try your best to keep the surveys anonymous. So if you have a lab manager within your team, have them aggregate the results. Don't really give the leader or the person providing feedback direct information about who is filling it out. Otherwise, you have problems with trust and faking, and by keeping them anonymous can help lower the likelihood of these biases coming to fruition. This is not necessarily a best practice within the literature, but I always like to think that you should ask for qualitative feedback at the end of the surveys. The qualitative feedback can add context to your quantitative data. And so when you do get the quantitative numbers back and you're able to assess your teams on these dimensions, the qualitative context provides you more information to better navigate the feedback that you're going to give based upon these measures. You also have the option of using background and trace data. Everyone's collecting data all the time. These are unobtrusively collected from some sort of mechanical source. Oftentimes in application, you see counts of emails or chats. Within research, you see sociometric badges, which are really cool. You put them on, and it measures, say, a lot of the distance between you and other teammates, and you can use that to create a network structure. But that's way beyond, I think, what many of us are going to be implementing in real life teams. These background trace data can provide you very basic information about team dynamics and outcomes. And my recommendation to you, if you want to use these, is use the generated reports that these communication softwares already deliver. So Microsoft Teams have usage reports and activity reports based upon folks' interaction with the interface. Monday and Asana also have things like goals met, usage time. I think Asana has a lot of third-party reports that can aggregate different inputs to create some sort of metric. But honestly, I'd be very careful with using these. They're only really useful when everyone is equally engaging with these collaboration softwares. And your team members may feel like it's being invasive, because it is. You're kind of micromanaging, as we talked about before, not the good kind. And they're limited in the sense that they cannot get at complex indicators of team dynamics yet. How is someone's interaction with the computer or chatting going to be indicative of the team's cohesion? That's a large inference that you have to make, and the data isn't there to support that we can get at those things yet. Maybe in the future, but not right now. And lastly, objective measures. These are usually good for team outcomes. So the amount of goals that are met, you can gather this information at meetings, progress towards deliverables, whether or not you've submitted publications, the number of patents submitted, the number of patients inoculated within a particular team, all sort of objective counting variables that you can get at the end of the day that can be useful. But they're mostly good for outcomes, and they may not be able to provide you with diagnostic information about what needs to be improved in terms of team dynamics. You may look at your outcomes and you can see that one team's performing well and another team's performing poorly, but you don't know why. And that's what the team dynamics measures get at. So when should you measure these things? If you're developing this measurement system for your team, well, it depends on the construct. So team processes should be measured frequently, and feedback probably provided quarterly. One thing about feedback that you have to realize is that it takes time to incorporate things. So if you ask someone to provide better communication habits, to be more diligent in working together, it takes time to adjust to those things. But you should see improvements on those relatively quickly if the feedback that you provided was good. Emergent states, you shouldn't measure them at first, and you should measure them after some sort of incident occurs or trigger occurs. So emergent states take time to develop. If you ask me how much I trust my other team members right from the get-go, or cohesion or psych safety, they're not going to provide you with a lot of information. Emergent states, well, emerge over time. And the speed at which they emerge over time is based upon events that occur with a team. For example, you develop psychological safety by team members being vulnerable and testing the waters and showing that to other team members. If no one ever does that, you're not going to develop psychological safety. So these things are best measured after some particular trigger or event occurs. So example would be maybe measuring transactive memory after a meeting on clarifying team roles, or measuring cohesion after a team performs a relatively interdependent task. So it's always good to measure these after some sort of event occurs. If these events don't occur, then emergent states are not going to develop, and you won't be able to really get anything from those measures. Team outcomes, the timing of these measures depends on the outcome. As we talked about before, with your, say, graduate student, weekly goals should be measured weekly, but progress towards deliverables as a whole should be measured quarterly. It all depends on the time sensitivity of the outcomes in mind. And so why you should measure it? Well, we already talked about this, right? You can't improve team effectiveness if you can't diagnose what is wrong. And so it allows you to provide some quality feedback at important times, which I believe Sean will be talking more about tomorrow.